Good evening, folks. My name is Mark Anthony Neal, Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies, one of the sponsors of tonight's event, along with the Duke Council for Race and Ethnicity, and along with the Center for Arts, Digital Culture, and Entrepreneurship, for what will be another conversation about the film Black Panther. Some of you might ask why another conversation about the film Black Panther, and of course my response would be, why not? Since it is a film that has clearly captured the imagination of many folks to the tune of more than $1 billion in revenue thus far globally, which makes it the most successful film ever that's Black themed and directed obviously by a Black director. The folks who will be joining us this evening for the conversation, I will start with the newly minted Dr. Israel Durham, having just defended his dissertation 2 weeks ago in the Department of English at Duke University. We're also joined by Ms. Kenya Harris, who is soon to be completing her master's degree in liberal studies at Duke University. And the great pleasure, particularly since she's been on leave this year, is to have my colleague, Wahneema Lubiano, join us this evening to talk about Black Panther. And it, in fact, will be Professor Lubiano who will get us started. Each of the panelists will have 5 to 7 minutes comment, and then we'll get into some conversation, and then you'll get into some conversation with them.
Okay, so this is on, yeah, this is on. Okay, this is gonna be a little choppy because I was cutting it down from what is now 30 pages of stuff. The title is Pleasure and Fictions That Mark the Moment. There are 2 frames for what I wanna talk about. The first, quote, "We don't know the history we're making sometimes until after our moments are gone, but we can take every chance to feel the joy of trying to make something new come into being," end quote. Those words are from Sincere Thunder, one of my undergrad professors at Howard University, and the one who introduced me to Marxist analysis and socialism. The second quote, "The purpose of discussing the cinema is not to show that we are keeping up with the times. These things are directly relevant to the imaginative resistances of people who have to live within capitalism, the growing points of social discontent, the projections of deeply felt needs. The task of socialism is to meet people where they are touched, bitten, moved, frustrated, nauseated, to develop discontent, and at the same time, to give some direct sense of the times and ways in which we live," end quote, and that's Stuart Hall. I'm engaged by the complexity of the movie, a story attentive to the constraints of its genre mix. And I say mix because the genres embedded in this movie are multiple: superhero comic, nationalist family romance, and Bildungsroman, the story of the heroes coming to consciousness. A production brought to us by Marvell, yet as Carvel Wallace put it in the New York Times, quote, "The film arrives as a corporate product, but we are using it for our own purposes," end quote. So there are 2 questions for me tonight in the vein of thinking about both how pleasure draws me into this movie and what becomes visible by virtue of that pleasurable engagement. How does the presence of love, both via and versus nationalism, drive our engagement with the movie? And what is the work of the CIA operative Everett Ross as a representation of power, a deliverer of exposition from the point of view of the common sense of the West, and the object of Shuri's power and instruction? So love first. T'Chaka, the flawed king, tells his son, who is seeking wisdom as he ascends the throne, quote, "Surround yourself with good counsel," end quote. It turns out that among the good counsel who surround him, it is Nakia whose good advice has long preceded the beginning of the story that we're watching, and who becomes the herald of new possibilities. The advice of T'Chaka turns out to be prophetic, regardless of his own compromised moral standing. And in response to the final question of the movie, asked of T'Challa by the youngster in present-day Oakland, "Who are you?" part of the proper answer might well be Nakia's trainee. I argue that not to diminish the importance of the figure of the hero king, but to pay tribute to the overturning of the conventions of the superhero genre by the screenplay and by the director. So in the beginning was colonial theft, genocide, slavery, and mass incarceration. And the film's interdiction of the present moment is represented by the museum, the history embedded in it, the CIA trading in stolen resources, and by the recitation of Eric Killmonger. Stolen is itself the nexus of the narrative's complexity, because if Eric / Njadaka and his father before him were trading in resources to which they could claim partial ownership as expatriate Wakandians, is the vibranium obtained for claw and to be traded to the CIA for diamonds stolen, actually stolen, or is it something to which Killmonger has a rightful claim? Is vibranium a Wakandan communal resource, or a resource whose accommodations rest in a legitimate or a legitimized king? If, as Killmonger asserts, the whole world originates in Africa, does all the world have the right to obtain vibranium? No, the payment for the history made by the conquerors is that the new conqueror in town or on the planet has a plan for redistribution that means a new and undefeatable larger African diasporan hegemony. Ndaka's plan is not only the possibility for revolution, it's not the only possibility for a revolution, for an overturning, but I'm staying right now within the movie's foregrounded narrative logic at that point. But the movie's multiple endings show us movement beyond those conventions. T'Challa emerges as the beneficiary of old and new knowledge, knowledge that Nakia has long tried to teach him, and his encounters with Eric / Njadaka, who adds new knowledge of the effect of Wakanda's isolation, prompts us to consider how the coming together of T'Challa and Nakia offers a vision of an alternative to Killmonger's binary, the conqueror versus the conquered, even while set within the frame of a nationalist family romance. What Eric is dragging through the family is the history that has made the world from which Wakanda has isolated itself, but which is also virtually carried in the family's own bloodline. Thus, the nationalist family romance knits itself together through the heterosexual love and through Nakia's representation as the savior of T'Challa, the family, and the nation. And the re-entry of Wakanda into Oakland and Black America, its investment here on this site, offers a different version of history, a different vision, a counter to Killmonger's belief that it is in his ascension to the throne that the engine for history will start over. The presence of T'Challa and Shuri there in the other part of the answer to "Who are you?" suggests a rearticulation of a different vision, but a vision that was present before the intervention of Killmonger. My particular interest in a complex story that's partially attuned to T'Challa as Nakia's trainee necessarily focuses on the presence of Ross, the CIA operative, who embodies the presence of the US state specifically and national state actors generally. A presence that not only reminds us of the reality of the machinations of the powerful, but presents us with an opportunity to see parallel structures of knowledge and interventions at work. The CIA, as a producer of knowledge, operationalized and deployed via war dogs and black ops, is connected to the making of Eric, and thus stains what Eric brings into the Wakandan family, the history of Black Americans both destroyed and vulnerable to state exploitation on its behalf. But if Killmonger's body is a recitation of his ties to US state violence in the larger world, T'Chaka's murder of Killmonger's father stands for the detritus T'Challa has inherited along with the throne of Wakanda. There are no clean players here. Where there is great power, there also rests its defiled deployments. If each scar on Killmonger's body represents his enmeshment in the U.S.'s violent being in the world, T'Chaka's murder of his actual brother is what the Black aesthetic critics would call a mass con, a massive concentration of Black American meaning and history. In this movie, that murder is a shorthand that places on Wakanda's king's shoulder responsibility for not averting or helping to avert the hideous result of white supremacy's effect, a way to equalize the violence of both strands of the family's tapestry. That Killmonger shoots and kills his romantic partner is indirectly juxtaposed to the old king's fratricide. Ross, however, not only connects Killmonger and the Wakandan throne, that connection's representation is fascinatingly multifaceted. The CIA's bankrolling of Claw and Killmonger's joint venture, its distribution of weapons to anyone or any place of its choosing, is temporarily at least halted in a display of quite lovely irony when Ross, literally talked through his function by Shuri, shoots down the ships carrying those weapons. It's a small moment of pleasure watching the CIA undo what the CIA has helped put in motion. But if the CIA, as an intelligence gathering machine, along with its violence in the making and molding of Killmonger, is directly represented, so is another kind of intelligence gathering and continuing attempts at intervening in the world differently from the destabilization and wiping out of resistance brought by Killmonger. Nakia is a spy, a gatherer of intelligence for the purposes of her own interventions. Her missions are to do on her own what she thinks Wakanda should do, offer assistance to those on Wakanda's borders who need help. If Killmonger and other war dogs and black ops operatives were sent out as the secret advance agents of the West, Nakia exists as a representation of something quite different from the dividing and maintaining that rests on Eric's world binary, a representation well served both by the pleasure of the aesthetics of Wakanda as well as the power resting behind the words, textiles, and cool clothes. So cool outfits, so casually and dismissively tossed out in Ross's estimation of Wakanda. If T'Chaka has to deal with the monster if T'Challa has to deal with the monster created by T'Chaka's family violence and Wakanda's tradition of isolation, but is also schooled by Eric, Nakia is the body and intelligence of what T'Challa ends up articulating in front of the UN. The remade world, then, that is offered by T'Challa as Nakia's trainee, and Nakia herself, along with Okoye and another woman warrior, being stared at by the CIA and the gathered international assemblage, is the mystery left before us at the end. Then while the CIA is smiling, the smiles of the Wakandan delegation suggest that possibly everyone in the audience, including Ross and the power of the West, are once again underestimating Wakanda. Nice work for a trainee.
So I think there's several things. First of all, I'm very, very excited about this version of the Black Panther. As some of you know, there have been so many versions, so many different versions, and what I really enjoy about this version compared to the comic is the similarities and the differences. So the heart-shaped herb is a similarity in the comic and in the current movie, which to me represents lots of things. An enlightened flower, an illuminated flower that's giving all people superpowers. In the comic version, Shuri, in some of the comics, Shuri does not exist. She was created by Reginald Hudlin in another version of Black Panther, and I like the character of Shuri because she is the sister of T'Challa, and she will be also inheriting the Black Panther legacy after him, and that's what happens in the comics. So I'm looking forward to what will happen to see if Shuri also becomes the Black Panther in the next version of the movie. Nakia also is a character who's in the Marvel comic and in the movie, but I liked what Coogler did with Nakia in the movie because she is not a villain. In the original comic, Nakia is actually a little unstable, and she actually is a part of the Dora Milaje, and through some difficulty, she becomes very jealous of T'Challa's actual girlfriend, and then gets removed for bad behavior, and then becomes a villain named Malice in the comics. So the fact that he made her a good guy and kind of made this like romance between the two of them, I kind of like that because that didn't happen in the comics. He was actually in the comics connected to Storm, the Marvel Comics character. In another version done in 2010 on BET, which was actually done by Reginald Hudlin, the famous actor Dejan Hansu played Black Panther. So to me, that's a really big jump from Dejan Hansu to Chad. Big difference. Also Eric, I'll save that the best for last. He is my favorite character. I love talking to young people about the movie because my children and everyone I've talked to under 18 agrees with me that Eric is not a bad guy, that he's a young, lost boy, is the way my son put it, and I really love that. I'm currently reading a book called Boys Adrift by Leonard Sachs, which talks about young men, and specifically young Black men, and the maneuvering in communities and finding their place. And I see that in Eric's character. Something that was problematic for me is I wanted to know where his mother was. We talked about that in a panel on Monday night about where his connection to Wakanda, but also his African-American connection, and where did he come from? Where's his mother? We know what happened to his father, but how did he get to the place where he is? There's no backstory on that, so I wanted more information about that. So, there you go.
Hello? Hi. So thank you for having me here on the panel. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to say, and ironically, I had not listened to the soundtrack until this afternoon. So I guess what I'll try to say is like somehow tied to one part of the soundtrack and then some of my own work. I work on melancholy. So I'm really interested in what it means to lose something and how that loss can be productive for a certain kind of performances of excellence that I call genius. So there's a song, and maybe it is that like this song on the soundtrack becomes a metaphor for what I hope will be coherent for what I'm about to say. There's a song on the soundtrack called All the Stars with SZA. And what's interesting about the song, when I was listening to it, is that there's a moment where she interpolates a song, or at least it sounds like she interpolates the chorus of Salt and Pepper's Let's Talk About Sex, where the chorus, part of the chorus where it says, let's talk about all the good things and the bad things that may be. Then I was like, oh, well, let me go listen to Salt and Pepper song. And in Salt and Pepper song, I think they interpolate, I'll take you there. So there's all this really interesting stuff that's going on around placement and places and locations. And so for me, that kind of genealogy, I think, actually helps to track some of what I've been thinking about with the film and some of the conversations I've had. So one in particular was I'm currently teaching a class in the Divinity School at Duke Howard Thurman, and in one of the precepts, a young woman who was from Liberia mentioned how, having seen the movie with her African friends and her Black American friends, there's an interesting disconnect that's occurred insofar as the African friends have said, this is how Black Americans understand Africa. Her Black American friends were saying, this is a great example of representation. We have not seen ourselves in this way before on the big screen. And in thinking about that, it brought me directly back to Killmonger. I find Killmonger to be a really intriguing character, especially around all of his loss. And one of the things that I find most interesting about him is that in all the ways in which there's a kind of interesting critique around the Africa in the mind of the Black American, Killmonger really puts some pressure on that. Precisely because, and I think too about sitting in on hip-hop class and teaching hip-hop, I mean, I'm so interested in what happens in that moment where he enters the palace and says, "What's my name?" And then speaks the language. So what's going on there around the idea that, like, even in the Black American mind about Africa, there is a knowledge about Africa that exists somewhere, whether it's through his father or some kind, because presumably he would not have learned the language from his father, because by the time, presumably he would have learned the language, his father had already died. So that in that loss of a parent, there is some level of genius that emerges from that loss, precisely around the fact that when he goes there, he says, "What's my name?" And thinking about hip hop, I mean, that genealogy around naming in hip hop is so relevant and goes all the way back to, say, someone like Muhammad Ali, who in that fight is hitting the man and saying to him, "What's my name?" Right? So I was thinking a lot about that. And I was also thinking about the idea that in many ways, especially around like the ways in which we have gone about naming ourselves, that in many ways Killmonger does in fact instantiate what's been kind of rendered in Black critical thought as the hyphenated existence. Insofar as he literally is an African American, right? Who we don't know who his mother is. His father, he's orphaned at a really young age, and yet somehow he goes about finding a way home, loosely understood. The other thing I found really, really interesting about the film, and I think Dr. Lubiano picked up on this, is the ways in which the women work in the film. And some of that has to do with what I think is maybe an interesting kind of parallelism that exists in the film. So I'd make the claim that I think that if we were to make the analogy of like Killmonger is to T'Challa, I would make the claim that Nakia is to Okoye, where I think that there are some interesting parallels around the ideas of like the maintenance of the nation and over and against a friend or a foe who is really invested in modes of insurrection. So that moment when Nakia and Okoye are talking and she says, "Because I love my country, I'm willing to defend it in a certain kind of way that you're not willing to do." So that even in this mode around, and even the fact that like in order for us to actually see the Black Panther emerge again, that it takes Nakia stealing the flower. So that all this work that's being done by the women in the film is really not only in the cause of a certain kind of love, but a certain kind of perspective about the maintenance of the nation, even if it is the case that the nation isn't always, in a kind of historical analysis, isn't always there for them. And I say that not necessarily about Wakanda, but in a kind of broad understanding of like the ways in which nations have been created and the ways in which Black people's relationships to the nation. And then the last thing I'll say is that I was thinking a lot about what it also means, and maybe this also goes back to the moment where I was talking about Killmonger, what it also means for Killmonger if I think about what the Liberian student said in my precept, what it means that when Killmonger dies, he references the ancestors. And so in all the ways in which there's this kind of reading of like Africa in the mind of the American, in the American mind, and specifically the Black American mind, that in that moment right before he dies, he says, "Put me in the ocean where my ancestors are," because they decided they preferred death over bondage Yeah. So like I said, especially thinking in the kind of melancholic sense around notions of like what it means to lose something and having that thing that you lose always being in your vicinity. I think that Killmonger going home is a really, really interesting idea for me. And also made me begin to think about what would it mean taking up a kind of similar stand or similar kind of endeavor that happens in Jewish communities. Like what would it mean if we had birthright trips? To Africa or parts of Africa, specific places in Africa. Yeah, that's just maybe a different kind of musing. But yeah, thinking about that and Killmonger and the ways in which he's so invested in going home. That was something that really sat with me as well. Yeah.
Thank you. So a couple of things. I was quite honestly confused by the excitement about the film. I wasn't a comic book kid, and a lot of that had to do with black kids who grew up in black households in which our parents told us that comic books were frivolous. And so the idea that we would somehow find some sense of ourselves in those comics, it was something that, at least in the case of my parents, my mother specifically, I couldn't have any comics. What struck me about it was the early days before the film comes out, the number of folks who were raising money to send hundreds of kids to see the film. Celebrities, fraternities, sororities, a range of institutions. I was struck by the number of folks who were invested in cosplay, which was part of the more refreshing aspects of the film, at least for me, because there's such a community of folks invested in that already, so to see that kind of bubble up in the mainstream gave us another sense of what blackness looks at this moment. But all those things struck me about the fact that what was really at play is this question of representation. And the way that particularly millennials are drawn to questions of representation have always troubled me. One, because despite how we might feel about some of the more popular expressions of blackness, there is in fact a wealth of diverse representations of blackness, as opposed to when, say, myself or Dr. Lubiano grew up, where there was a real crisis of representation because there were none. Right? I mean, you literally could count on five fingers on a hand watching television in the 1960s. You can count the number of black people that you would see. Bill Cosby's going to be on some show tonight, and 20 people come over to somebody's house, right? The black person in the neighborhood who has a color TV to watch it, right? I mean, that was a real representation crisis. So it struck me as really odd that we're having these representation conversations at this moment, particularly in the context of a digital archive in which there's a wealth of representation that folks have access to now. And I joked with Israel about this before. When folks saw Get Out last year and were talking about it as the most woke film they've ever seen, my first reaction was that y'all haven't spent much time in the archive. Because if you had seen Sankofa, you wouldn't react to Get Out the same way. That being said, the film has made more than $1 billion globally. I'm ambivalent always when black cultural products outproduce what black consumption can generate. There's this funny moment in Byron Hurt's film, Hip Hop Beyond Beats and the Rhyme, which is about sexism and gender relations in hip hop. And he's interviewing a rapper who's talking about album sales. That's Jadakiss specifically. And Jadakiss is like, once you get past 700,000, it's all white people. Right, and it's anecdotal, right? There's no actual basis to that. But the part of the point he was making is that black consumption can only drive revenue to a certain point. And so I'm as ambivalent about that in terms of Black Panther as I am about Michael Jackson selling 100 million copies of Thriller. What's to be said about a Black cultural product and the pleasure that we derive from it? That when all is said and done, we can't control necessarily how it gets consumed, right? There's a point where we're no longer in control of the narrative of this film, right? Because we're not the people driving the consumption. Just throwing it out there for y'all.
So we shouldn't say more right now.
I mean, you're the Marxist in the room, so.
Because I already want to fight.
You already want to fight? Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. A couple things.
Use mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. There's a couple things that I think, and Mark was gracious in suggesting that we occupy the same generational space. No, we don't. Okay, so the idea that there's a wealth of representation that's available to us speaks to the jaggedness of history and accessibility, right? Once we say archive, we've already evoked a layer of access that stands as a means of fracturing what the we is. Once we are on the terrain of mass commodification, then we know from hip-hop's spectacular success that we're already dealing with the consumption of representation, of music, of art that goes far beyond. There's never been a time that we have driven the availability, the circulation of art or culture produced by us or messed with by other people, all of these things. So there's a way in which cynicism, which I always think I never have enough of, doesn't help me think about what drives consumption, and neither does it help me think about what are the complexities of the consumption that's being driven, right? So in the older part of the history of Mark and me, let's just say, I remember the boom of excitement that was repeating another cycle from 30 or 40 years ago around representations of Blackness, especially with the aesthetics of Africa as part of the scaffolding, both for the recognitions and for the circulation and for the money that has been made. So I don't come into this already thinking that there's something happening here that's never happened before. The scale makes a difference, which is why I was interested in the beginning with looking at something that was a production of Marvel, because Marvel has already skewed the stakes for representation and what it produces in terms of profit. So we're in a different landscape. Being on that landscape, though, and it's one of the reasons that I referenced Wallace's piece in the New York Times, but there are other people who have made the same arguments in other places. On the terrain of mass commodification and capitalism, there are no ways to either police or completely understand consumption, especially if consumption stands in for being duped. And that's the vulgar Marxist understanding of consumption, that audiences are duped by the piece itself, by the object, and therefore it is the intention of the director, the screenplay, the producer that think the possibilities for that consumption. Because I'm interested in cultural studies, it's not a view that I think is especially helpful. Consumption is so complicated that counter-consumption drives a certain kind of pleasure. And part of what I wanted to do was work through both things. What pulls you in? Like when Kenya was talking about Eric Monger, I am both fascinated by the performance and completely blindsided by my own resistance to the pleasure of that performance. I can't forget that he kills his girlfriend, okay? So seeing him as a lost boy is a jump for me. On the other hand, the minute I recognize that in my own response to the movie, I have to push back, not because I can outsmart my pleasure. I can't, I can work with it, but pleasure doesn't easily yield to rational accommodations. Once I'm realizing that I am resisting being drawn in by Killmonger, then I have to push myself to say, and if you're resisting the murder of the girlfriend, and you're also critical of the CIA's making of Killmonger, what do you do with Chikaka's murder of his brother? And if that is extrapolated to the cost of Wakanda's isolation for Black Americans, right? Then you don't have an easy dividing way to say good, bad, right? So what do I do with my pleasure? Since I can't outsmart it, I at least look for the counters, the things that push me in another direction, even as my eyes are filled and my ears are filled, by what I'm seeing played before me.
As Mark was talking, I thought about two things. I thought about the ownership of the movie, the ownership of Blackness, and I've been thinking recently, before the movie came out and once the movie came out, a lot of people are walking around and happily saying, Wakanda forever, and it's fun, it's a joke, and somewhat, but I also think it's sort of a representation for us, sort of like something we can hold on to say that we do have some ownership of it by saying Wakanda forever. I think that in a way, everybody wants to be Black, but nobody really wants to be Black. We had a student say that in class last night. I think it's nice to own the parts of Blackness that are, exciting and that we can be proud of, but there are parts of our history and culture that, we don't even want to claim. So I think that, it's just important to, be aware of how we're represented in the movie as Black people in America. When I watched the movie, I looked at T'Challa and I thought, wow, this is awesome. Look at this Black man. He has this, group of Black women around him, protecting him, saying, don't touch him, or I'll throw you through a wall. But when we look at Eric Killmonger, who is Black and American, I have to say that I can identify more with him because he's angry about his current situation. He grew up in a single-family home and is searching for something that he hasn't found yet within his history. So as an African-American person, I think as a Black person, I definitely identify more with Eric. And yeah, I think that, as Wahneema said, it's important to think about the differences between ourselves as African Americans and as Africans. And I also was thinking about what Israel said about how differently Africans are seeing the movie from how we're seeing it. And what would it have been like if he had been welcomed into Wakanda? What would the movie have looked like if there was a fight but not to the death? What would it look like if any Black person were to go to Africa and be welcomed with open arms? So it raises some interesting points. I felt like the end of the movie, I felt like they kind of tried to wrap it up really quick at the end. I was kind of insulted by him getting the building. That really didn't do a lot for me. It just kind of felt like, oh, okay, let's, find a place that we can put Nakia so she's close to me, but actually she doesn't want to be your queen and she wants to be independent. So that part didn't really work well for me. And I don't understand the trip to the UN. I don't understand any of that. as a comic book lover, as someone who's into Marvel, who's watched all the movies, if you saw the movie where Black Panther was introduced, which was, I think, Captain America: Civil War, his father is killed while at a UN meeting. So it's kind of like, you know, are you not reading the writing on the wall? Why are you now opening your arms to the UN, but not to the African American community? So.
I want to pick up on something you just said, Kenya, about the women in the film, the women in Wakanda. I moderated another panel a few days ago, my colleague Jerry Philogene, and we had a rich conversation about the gender pieces. For all the power that we see from Okoye and the other women in the film really reproduces the logic of any Black Christian church in America, right? Where the 80% of the women who are in those church will protect their minister, right? Often against nefarious behavior, but they don't have direct access to the power of the pulpit in those spaces, or in this case, access to the throne. And so ultimately it becomes a film that actually recirculates very time-tested and well-worn narratives about Black men or men fighting over leadership, right? And it's a Hollywood film, so that it makes absolutely sense. It's a Ryan Coogler film, and as great as Ryan Coogler is as a filmmaker, all of his films have been about this kind of trauma and tragedy of Black masculinity, whether it's Oscar Grant in Fruitvale Station, you know, Creed and Michael B. and the loss of his father, right, in the ring, right, and him being in foster care and all those kinds of things. I mean, those are the things that have always empowered his filmmaking. What would a real progressive Afrofuturistic version or vision of gender look like in Wakanda, right, as we think about the film, you know, franchise going forward?
Something I'll also say too, maybe piggybacking off of what Dr. Lubiano says, that, and it's not only that he kills his girlfriend, but he also kills one of the warriors, right? So that even then there's such a complication around how we should feel about him. So I even remember someone saying to me that I guess, so, and even thinking about consumption, so like I've only read one think piece about the whole film. I kind of deliberately only read one. It was a really good piece about the, I guess in one of the comics there are queer, like overtly queer characters. Yeah. And the idea that, you know, it would have been lovely to see that in the film, but at the same time, in a 2-hour and 15-minute film, you can't accomplish everything, right? But even in terms of thinking about consumption too, what I maybe, and I don't know if maybe this will make any sense to the kind of broad conversation we're having right now, but what I found really interesting was the first time I saw the film, which was the Saturday after it came out, someone pulled out a phone camera and started recording it. I don't know, and I don't know what that might mean for the kind of conversation we're having about consumption, insofar as what does it mean that, like, even for a film where people are like, don't do that, we want to make sure whatever, that there are still these insurrectionary modes, whatever, that are still going on. And what was interesting was that, and it was a teenager who was doing it, right? So yeah, the consumption piece, I don't know. I'm kind of like you. I'm like, because I mean, I didn't get up and say like, hey, somebody's over here, you know, like that. Yeah, right, exactly. So in a way, like even in that moment of consumption where he has paid for the ticket, the fact that he is recording the film to presumably go share with someone else. So there's something going on there that I think maybe is interesting in line of what you're saying and what you just shared. Yeah, I'll just throw that out.
I mean,
there too.
that's interesting, right? Because it also talks about a generational shift, right? In the early days of Spike Lee films, right? When Spike Lee, especially his first 3 films, I mean, it was a big deal for folks to go out that first weekend, because if you didn't go out the first weekend, it wasn't guaranteed you would find the film the second weekend. But there were all kinds of controversies about folks going to Spike Lee films and buying tickets and realizing that the ticket that they bought right, didn't say that it was a ticket to a Spike Lee film or some other film in the theater. And so there was always all these conspiracy theories about, we're spending money on this Spike Lee film. Is this film actually making the kind of money that we think it should make? We're not having those conversations now about Black Panther, in part because of what Wahneema said. The scale of Marvel has changed what we think. We can't make a dent, right? And this is a kid who might got 5 siblings who he can't bring to the movies, and so he can just go home and watch it with his 5 brothers and sisters, and it's all good, really, right? Because they need to be able to connect to it also. But it is a different kind of moment in that regard. One of the things we talked about in the title of it, Black Panther, Wakanda, and Liberation, to talk about a term that's a little bit more amorphous. I joked at some point, and thankfully there were actually organizations who did this, that it'd be nice when folks were going to these opening sessions of Black Panther that folks could register to vote. And I mentioned that to Melissa Harris Perry, and she pushed back really quickly, saying that we're actually overrepresenting Black women in particular, but Black voters are overrepresented in terms of percentages of folks who vote. So, the question is that is not that we're not registered, right? But it seemed as though if folks could organize the way that they could around the movie, in some ways it seems a little frivolous. We're wondering what other ways can we take those energies, do certain kinds of organizing. That being said, is Wakanda the success of Black Panther? What does that say about some sort of idea of what Black liberation looks like or can look like? Whether that's realized in the context of the film, right, or what we do with the film in the aftermath of our consumption of it.
Registration drives.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah, that's
Oh, okay.
folks who did that, right. Yeah, we're waiting for you.
Wait, what? No, I want other people to talk, but the selfish part of me will fill up any silence with stuff I want to say. But some part of what I've been fascinated by is the pleasure of hearing what other people say, since I don't care how much it differs from what I'm thinking. I'm trying to figure out what are the triggers that produce that response.
I'll just throw this out there, maybe in line with what you're saying and in line with your question. So what, today in class we were talking about notions of utopia and what it means that the idea of utopia is a dream that exists in the human mind as a place that we're always aiming to get to. And so I think that there's a way in which seeing Wakanda on the screen, it becomes a utopic vision that we imagine ourselves to want to aim for, grasp for. But in class I said, but the interesting thing about utopia, which is why I think at the level of it being a dream, it's really interesting to think about. It's always a vision people have of something, is that I really believe that if we were to have a Wakanda, we'd want something more than that. That Wakanda would not ever be enough for us, right? And so even thinking about, so being said, even thinking about the etymology of utopia, it literally means no place. So that even the idea of it being a dream in the mind, in the human mind, is something that suggests that Wakanda is but a dream, in a certain kind of way, right? But I think that, but I think about Sekou Sundiata, and I think about other people where maybe the work that we have to do is to do the work of aiming for or creating a world that is getting to something that looks like Wakanda, right? That it's never something that we will ever, it's the same kind of conversation we have about truth and justice, that maybe these are not things that we will actually ever gain, grasp, capture, hold on to, but that our work is really about how is it that we can make a world where those are things that seem plausible ideas, plausible things that we can actually aim for, presumably can create. And the other thing too, I think is really interesting, and so I'm like you, the UN part bothered me a little bit. And there's a part of me that wonders if there's another film, how they'll deal with it, in part because in the opening of the film, the way that Wakanda is read is that it's read as a third world country, and then they go into Wakanda. The spaceship goes into Wakanda. So at the end, that parallelism where I guess the ambassador says, I mean, what can we learn from a third world country? And so even then I'm like, so is the understanding, so when T'Challa gets up and says like, we will open up our doors, I'm like, are you opening up your doors to the third world country, or are you opening up the doors to the inner sanctum? Like what, and like, yeah, what's.
Why now do you want to open the doors?
Yeah, and like, and especially if the whole point of keeping the doors closed was precisely because you see all of this colonization that's happening to your people.
Because supposedly Wakanda is the only African country that hasn't been colonized.
Right. So I'm like, well, okay, so are we, or is it that like the facade that you have up for the world of this third world country that hides this like, paradise, is it that somehow you're going to give resources to the third world country and still keep so there were like a lot of questions I had about like what is going on with the notion of utopia that's happening even in the film, and why is it that like even at the level of us as the onlookers, knowing that Wakanda is this paradise, that's still to the world that is this third world country that has nothing to teach us.
Right.
Yeah. So. Yeah.
How much though of, because I like what you just rolled out, how much of that image though of Wakanda actually devalues what the success of the African American experience has been? Because when you pose a question like, what's to be learned from a third world country, there's actually a lot to be learned from a third world country, because they have to have, be clear about survival techniques that are of value for them to be able to survive in a global economy and global capitalism and all these kinds of things. So there actually is much to be learned. And so when you consider the kinds of things that Wakandans don't have to struggle with because they have access to these resources, and compare that to, the old adage of make a way out of no way, right? The ongoing historical 3-century practice of black folks engaged in social improvisation, right, in order to survive. There are actually tools of value that we see in the African American experience that speaks to the fact that, if we had Wakanda, we, in some ways, wouldn't want it anymore, right? Because, part of what keeps us compelled and locked into what this moment is the fact that we're always in this kind of moment of survival, right? And is that enough? Is that pursuit of liberation through this kind of guise of survival and challenge and suffering and what have you, is that in fact the thing that we find of value in the notion of liberation, since, liberation is not a there, right? And it's never a there that we've witnessed, right? It's folks walking off plantations in 1865 saying, I'm free, and, what does that actually mean, right, to them in that particular moment? Gonna open it up to y'all. Questions, comments?
It's me. So what you just said about what is it we learn? I think that when Eric dies at the end, we're really getting a picture of his being stuck in this, the ideas about slavery, the way they impact us today, and I think he's exhibiting an idea that we can never get away from that. We're stuck. And I say that because, and you'll have to help me with these characters, but remember the character whose kingdom was far away, and he comes in and he's M'Baka. Okay. So he fights, but he concedes. And he concedes because he understands that he has a role to play in his kingdom, and indeed, his role was very important. So Eric could have, he said that he couldn't concede because he would be imprisoned. And so that's saying to me that he could have ended this battle the same way that M'Baka ended his battle, right? But he can't see that. And so to me, it's like this movie gives us a picture of the the way somehow Africa, even though it's been colonized, but people have some sort of a vision that we as African Americans don't have and can't see. And liberation for us could be opening our eyes to some new possibilities, some agency that we don't always embrace.
Hi, I actually have two questions for the panel. The first one is around a theme that I felt was happening throughout the movie around reparations and what potentially Wakanda owes to African Americans. And I really felt that when Shuri calls the CIA agent a colonizer. And I thought that was a very interesting statement when Eric Killmonger essentially makes the claim that Wakanda, in their isolationist policies, are essentially just as culpable of the colonization that's happening. And so what does Wakanda owe to African Americans and the African continent, given the resources that they have, and what do those reparations look like? Because I don't think buying a building in Compton, that doesn't touch it. And the second question that I have is around institutions and institutional power. I thought it was very interesting how the people of Wakanda rely heavily on tradition in their government. And when Eric Killmonger asks for a battle with T'Challa for the throne, I thought it was very interesting that he said yes, because it seemed to me that he didn't have to say yes. He said yes out of almost a feeling of guilt. And when he lost, and Okoye and Nakia were having a conversation about what they owe to their country, and Nakia was almost saying, forget the tradition that says we have to listen to Eric. I need to go against that. At what point do we have a responsibility to shirk our traditions of government and our institutions to ensure the survival of our country? And I think we're kind of seeing that maybe with Donald Trump right now. At what point do we have to say we have to forget the traditions of our institutions to ensure its survival?
I think you're dead on about the tradition piece, and I also think tradition is a stand-in for black respectability politics. Think about what fractures the support for T'Challa in the film. His inability to bring back Claw, right, is what fractures that support. The reason why he doesn't bring back Claw dead, because literally at that moment where he can kill Claw, right, it's the folks around him saying, the world is watching you now, right? And we need to represent blackness in a certain kind of way. And in fact, it's his failure to kill Claw in that moment that comes back to bite him, right? Because Eric doesn't have anything to sell, right, to the other folks in Wakanda if Claw is dead. And it struck me really, it's really powerful, because it's like the world is watching you, right? And think about how many times black political culture has been driven by this idea they're watching us, right? We need to act a certain kind of way. We need to talk a certain kind of way, right? It's Obama lecturing, black kids about pulling up their pants, right? It comes out of that same kind of politics, right? So tradition, which becomes very conservative, right, becomes this kind of extension of black respectability politics.
Everything he said. The reparations question is an interesting one. I don't have a fully formed answer except to say I don't know if Wakanda owes anything. I'll just say that. I don't know if it does. Yeah. That's all I got. If I were to ponder it a little bit longer, I probably would have something more substantive to say, but yeah, because there's a part of me that thinks like embedded in the question is that it lets some people off the hook. And maybe Wakanda isn't on the hook. So I don't think, I'm not sure if it owes anything. Even though, and I think it goes back to what Dr. Lubiano said, even though I think that what Eric Killmonger says is quite, it's enticing when he goes there and says, you have all of this and our people are dying. Like, why not help? It is very enticing. And there's a part of me, like, in my own kind of theoretical frame, that thinks that really what we're seeing in the film is like the Afro-pessimist and the Black optimist fight in a certain kind of way, where like the pessimists are like, everything is going to hell, like, you know, in the form of Killmonger. Like, everything is going to hell, like, what we need to do is like go kill everybody because we live in an anti-Black world, right? And then the optimists are like, no, we have to like maintain the resources, like we need to, you know, whatever. Or that there's like a better way. I mean, like I said, that's a very like loose reading of the film, but I think that there's something going on there that I think like even past like the kind of entertainment aspect of it, like there's some theoretical things that I think are at play. But all that to say, like, yeah, I don't know if Wakanda owes Black Americans anything. And maybe that's also because when Killmonger could have come home, they didn't bring him home.
Right. That's what I was going to comment on. I was going to say that Wakanda does not give a damn about Black people. And that's clear in the fact that T'Challa's father, left the young boy there, knowing he existed, and left him there. And then I think that T'Challa has to then carry the burden of his father and ends up basically walking in his footsteps by killing his cousin the same way his father did. So I think that the question for me, I think of, is where is the freedom for Blacks? Is it in death? Because that's really fucked up. If that's what freedom means for Black Americans, is death, because Killmonger got free. So I find that extremely problematic. I think that the other part that, you know, makes Killmonger such a dynamic character is the struggle, his struggle. He's struggling with what's happening to him. And I just don't feel like anybody else is struggling. You know, everyone else is in a pretty good position. You know, Wakanda wants for nothing. And I don't see any open arms for anyone. And if there was an opportunity for them to reach out, then it would have been the moment when he came in. And, you know, my favorite line in the movie is when he goes, "Hey, auntie," because that's Black, that's Black American. And that's him inserting himself in the African environment and being shut out. That scene could have went a lot of different ways. I mean, he had the mark, it's on his lip, he's a part of it. Why not accept him? The difference is he has a colonized mind. The CIA calls him one of his. He has the markings, you know. He is of that origin, so why is he not accepted?
I want to go back to the question of reparations, right? Where Israel, you said, I don't know if Wakanda owes anything to. If we think about how the CIA thread runs through this, right? That actually helps us with imagining what might be owed because of the nature of the intervention, right? If the CIA is one thread that tells us the world is made by the powerful who can intervene and change it, right? Then another thread, not on the same scale, of world misery as the CIA, but still visible, is Wakanda intervened, right? And you can say, well, Wakanda intervened at a particular moment, 1992, but the longer history says Wakanda intervened when it didn't intervene, you know, which was hundreds, thousands of years ago. So reparations then seems to be one way to say, if what joins together pessimism and optimism is not the death of a particular figure, although that's part of it, it can be what are the world making and unmaking possibilities, you know? Because I agree with Kenya. Eric's death suggests that there is freedom in death, in which case his dead girlfriend and the dead Dora Milaje are really free. Do we want to let him off the hook because he's a practicer of the freedom that we've already been trained to consume in a pleasurable way, right? All of the stories about fighting the fights and being martyred, fighting the fights and having your entire village, country, whatever, go up in flames, feeds the aesthetic that the ultimate victory is death on behalf of your right or your freedom. Well, what if, again, caught in the constraints of the genre, this is the story of the coming to consciousness of a king. What if the alternative is represented by Nakia, who both looks like the CIA in some of her actions, but the intervention is not meant to take something from someone to destabilize the government, but can you bring something? Now, on the one hand, there's a part of me says, yeah, it's fucking good old liberalism, right? You know, the one good person who does the good thing. But we've already admitted that we're in the realm of the superhero, which is a humanist liberal construct. So we can think about, well, within that construct, Nakia both looks like the CIA and looks violently unlike the CIA, and more to the point, she's trying to usher in a new history that is the opposite of abandonment, and therefore requires a form of reparations. Now, part of what we do with the fantasy is look at the way the fantasy drags the world, the real world into it, and the way we drag the real world into it. And so you can say that thinking about the genre conventions represents a way to both have the real world, but have the real world within the terms of the genre itself, right? So, okay, so I'm gonna give up and say, yeah, that's what I'm doing, you know? But on the other hand, it gives us a way to think about the economies of narrative gesture. So I quoted Sincere Thunder, right, my professor, and this is like more years than I'm willing to admit to in public ago, when we were talking about popular culture and revolution, because in the 60s and the 70s, people talked about that a lot. This isn't the first time we've done it. And in talking about it in the classroom, Sincere wanted us to consider two things. One goes to what you said about utopia, but the other goes to the question of what you do with popular culture other than consume it with no mindfulness, right? So the part that goes to utopia is this conversation was going on in the context of Sincere wanting sincerely to interrupt the notion that liberation is a utopic elsewhere that we can't get to. He wanted to say, what if we take seriously all the messiness of the lives we're actually living, and we think about utopic possibilities in those actual lives. So he was arguing about popular culture as a way for us to start suturing together our ideas of utopic interactions. This, he said, this argument, these deeply held convictions, these commitments, this is part of remaking the world. Unless you're saying the world is only remade when we see the material evidence of its remaking, in which case then when a huge extra-governmental entity, or the CIA, you know, my favorite whipping boy, produces evidence of the changed world. Does that make sense?
And I think, too, one of the reasons why I maybe wince a little bit at the idea of reparations is because, I mean, in the early part of the film, what we see Nakia doing is that she's saving people in what appears to be like some kind of like child slavery, some kind of sex trafficking thing, right?
Boko Haram.
Boko Haram, exactly right. Something that looks like that, right? And at the same time, and I think this is where like the film is complicated, which maybe is why the conversations are going on, because there's a part of me that thinks that there's some really clever things going on. So on the one hand, Nakia is saving these people, but actually also is an agent of the state in a certain kind of way, right? Right. But at the same time, so is Eric's father.
Yeah.
So like, what do we do with the fact that like, if we're thinking about notions of reparative justice or reparations, that Eric's father is in the United States arming people with vibranium in order to combat the everyday violences that they are experiencing.
That's why I was saying, is it stolen?
Right, exactly.
Or is it simply being laid claim to?
And repurposed, right. So it gets complicated, I think, when we think about the reparative work, because presumably Wakanda is doing reparative work in the United States, but at the same time, and I think it goes back to your point, but at the same time, that reparative work ends up being the death of somebody. So what does it mean then that like in the cause of doing reparative work in the United States that Eric's father dies, and then Eric, by way of the CIA, is then turned? So the layers of it, I think, are really, and maybe it is that Coogler is doing some really interesting work, and the screenplay writers doing interesting work around like us being somewhere in the middle for most of the film, because you're like, I mean, yes, Nakia, we're all behind you, but at the same time, by the end, you're at the UN with everybody. Standing up, like, prepared to, like, presumably, like, have a hand in some kind of gesture to colonialism that may be happening in Black Panther 2, right? So, yeah, I mean, everything you're saying, yeah, I'm with you.
At this point, but I did want to, my thought initially was when you made the comment about what does Wakanda owe to African Americans, my thought in a lot of that and conversations around that is like, when are we going to turn back to what America owes Black Americans? Because at the end of the day, we're Americans, and Americans are the ones that have stolen from Africa in order to create the American empire. And Black Americans, at the end of the day, I'm an American. You know what I mean? I understand that I have African blood, I have African roots, and I'm very proud of that. But when I think of where we need to look at in terms of what we are owed and whom or who owes us, it should be the American government, I think. Because a lot of times I feel like when we have these discussions about lower income, socially disadvantaged Black Americans and then Black middle class, there's kind of a clashing between those two levels where it's like, why are we letting the greater American populace off the hook for their role in this scenario and in their situation? And I can understand how a country like Wakanda would potentially have some onus into looking at, okay, like Killmonger's point, these are your brothers and sisters. Even though we're American, we're still Pan-African. But at the same time, we're still American. And Americans are the ones that have taken from us. So when is the responsibility going to be put on them? Because aside from the wealth of resources that Wakanda has naturally, America at this point has a wealth of resources that it has logically stolen, right? But they own them at this point. So when are we going to start making sure that we put true onus and focus it there and actually make them give it back, do whatever they need to do, whether that's through reparations or whatever. My friends and I had a conversation at one point about the movie and how she was disappointed in the fact that they showed, you know, another civil war in an African country. But to some extent, my thought was there are, in essence, minor civil wars taking place in America all over the place. The difference is one side does not have enough resources to actually be viable in that war. Like if you think about like Ferguson or Baltimore or whatever, you would have an uprising that was immediately quelled because, as Njobu was trying to give his exact point, they're trying to give these people resources because they don't have that. So people look at America as this utopic thing, but no, we're constantly having clashes. We're constantly having civil wars amongst ourselves as well. But the black populace doesn't have the resources to even be a threat in the way that Wakabi and the border tribe standing behind Eric Killmonger had that. And then I wanted to ask you about, your thoughts on traditions, because in some respects I can understand how they need to kind of be dismissed because they can be destructive to newer generations, but in some respect also, aren't those what give us our backbone? I think of the ways that my father trained me in forcing us to do like Kwanzaa every year and things like that. And now with my own kids, I don't make them do Kwanzaa, but the knowledge that I learned from being forced to do those things as a young child kind of informed discussions that I can take into, another colleague or something that is a non-black that doesn't understand things like redlining and gentrification and how those things that my parents lived through are now impacting us. But those things I learned because of traditions that my father imposed on me.
I would love to hear the panel answer the question about what gender would look like in a truly progressive vision of Wakanda.
What gender would look like in a truly progressive Wakanda.
That's a really good question. I think there's different versions of Black Panther. It's important to say that Israel mentioned earlier a version of Black Panther written by Roxane Gay, who in her version, in her comic book version, wrote a love triangle between Okoye, another Dora Milaje, Ayo. They had a love relationship, and then she's also in a love relationship with Wakabi. And so I think what's great about Coogler is that he has taken little pieces of all of the movies and put together what he thought was the best version. I guess I don't really have an answer for what a better gendered movie would look like. I think that Coogler's version is definitely the best in terms of giving women a voice, even though most of the characters are in the other comics and in the other versions. I think that in Coogler's version, the women have the most voice.
It's a tough question to ask because it takes the form of an ontological inquiry. What is, as opposed to something that's a little bit easier to talk about. Under what circumstances might we see gender perform differently, right? So the moment in the movie when Okoye and Nakaya are arguing with each other about the next step is one of the moments that works against women's gendering in this genre and many other genres where women come at each other over a man, right? Or they come at each other over their children. Both things are allowable for women. But in this film, women go at each other and at men over ideas of what should be, right? So that, for me, is a moment where we can see progressive movement in gendering. And to get at it, then we have to have before us the counter, right? What is the norm? What is the tradition? How do you work with tradition so that it both makes its appearance and something else makes its appearance? Okay, Kugler in the screenplay chose that. But I'm also interested in, and I know how horrible this sounds if we can only think about violence in terms of real life, but this is a fiction. It is a representation of violence. As such, violence is a dramatic intensification of what we know from everyday life. So it can be a kind of punctuation. I love watching women fight, right? And I love watching women fight without myself wanting to go out into the street and hurt somebody, right? But there's a way in which representation is a kind of currency that offers us a place where we can imagine relations that are other than what they are. So violence in that context then is amazingly appealing to me as a way to think about the limitations of gender. Now, of course, someone can always say, but actually, there are women soldiers in real life. Yes, I know, right? But part of what we do with violence in real life is get really uneasy about it. So if a nation has a respectable insurgency and includes women fighters, then we're all like, yeah, right? But if there are women just sort of walking through the world responding to things by fighting, we get uneasy. And you watch people, and that's where respectability politics rears, that's one of the places where it rears its head. But there's also the possibility that gender itself, as it's conceptualized, is a description of a symptom of something that's not good, right? Gender is about an accommodation of one kind of person to other kinds of persons, right? What if the accommodation is gone? What if the hierarchy disappears, right? Then do we need a progressive version of gender, or do we have a changed world? Does that make sense?
What I love about what Wahneema just said, because even as we're thinking about this framework in the context of Wakanda, as much as we could imagine that in Wakanda, we're actually imagining what that might look like in our own lives. And one of the ways I think the representation politics for me come back are particularly vital. You know, as a 52-year-old male, I can take for granted the representation of the women in that film in a certain kind of way, in the way that my 15-year-old daughter, right, is going to read that very differently because she's not as tied to the gendered aspects of it or the ideological aspects of it, but she's also seen the kind of power that these women are evoking and invoking, which becomes a possibility for her to imagine herself. And representation in that regard, I think, is really important. And in the moment that we've lived through the last 10 days with the Amy Sherald painting, and the 2-year-old girl just amazed at this portrait of Michelle Obama, and just the wonderment in her face is like we take for granted how powerful those kind of representational moments are. But of course, the challenge for us is that how do we take those moments and move on from them, right? How do we not stay caught up in those kinds of moments? You were mentioning the different kinds of ways in which, is the end game of blackness death? You think about the work of someone like Fred Moten and other folks in this idea of fugitivity. The genius of blackness, and look at it in terms of popular culture, we create things, it's amazing, it becomes too commodified, and we move on to something else, right? I mean, that's historically been it. We literally leave it behind. And so the whole history of black survival has been always being ready to decamp. We get to this space, we build some stuff, always knowing that very shortly we need to pack up, we need to decamp, and we need to move on as a way that connects our survival. And so I think we have to think about Black Panther in this context also, right? Whatever's been achieved in this moment, right? What do we take from that and move on to create and build other things?
I want to think about that and the question of the pleasure of both recognizing a gender norm being violated and then trying to imagine what a world would look like where that violation wasn't pleasurable because of the world, right? It's that trade in representation as a kind of currency that, to go back to Sincere Thunder, he was trying to get at. What if we were to think about the exchange that we've had as we're considering what goes on in the movie as a way to imagine that for which we don't have a form right now or language? And I was thinking about the moment when General Okoye throws her wig at that white boy that she's fighting with in the casino. And I thought, okay, as a member of the group that affirms follicle spareness as an aesthetic, I found myself cheering, because I thought, that's one of the things. I'll forgive a movie a lot that does that, right? And then I thought, okay, and right there, those are the conditions for pleasure in this moment. In another moment, it wouldn't have the same hold on my imagination.
And I would say too, thinking about questions of gender. So I mean, and I think it goes back to something you said earlier, like the fact that presumably there'll be a second film where we don't know the kind of ways in which his sister will have a certain kind of power that she can inhabit, I think is really intriguing, because presumably we don't know if there's any kind, I mean, we only know by way of the hierarchy of men, the kind of ways in which royalty is allotted. But what if, maybe what if the sister is queen? But the other thing too, I think to your point, is that, for me, a moment of pleasure that I think also traffics, to your point, in a kind of interesting trope around Black women, is the moment in the end when Okoye stops the rhinoceros.
Yes.
So that her power is both in the physical world in terms of the animals and over and against her lover. So that in that moment I was like, yeah, I'm on board with that kind of like interesting pleasure of seeing that the rhinoceros is so indebted to her power that not only does he stop, but then he licks her. Like there's something about that was really, to me, like, yeah, it's a power and a love that exists between these two entities that are presumably different in ways that, like, between her and her lover, it's not that. Even so much so that he actually says to her in that moment, like, you'd hurt me, like,
Kill.
Right, kill me, right, my love, right? So even in that moment, the pleasure of seeing that kind of subversive act, I think, so I mean, yeah, so there's a part of me that would say that, like, actually even in the kind of interesting tropes that exist, that the film does some interesting things around gender that can help us to maybe think about the modes of pleasure that we see, and even though we might want to, like, divorce ourselves from it, we're like, yes, rhinoceros, like, stop. You're in the presence of the greatest warrior in Wakanda, right? And that's also the fact that that's also something that's repeated over and over and over again, even by Nikki in that moment when they're talking, she says, you're the greatest warrior we have. Or even the moment, to me, also pleasure, when she throws the spear in the car chase. So you're like, oh yeah, like, I'd follow her into battle. Like, probably quicker than I'd follow T'Challa into battle, right? So yeah.
So what we're pointing to is the specific historical context that produces that pleasure, right? Absent this thing, that would not have captured me so completely.
I think one thing I was thinking about that just kind of rubbed me wrong was I had this thought as I was looking at the Dora Milaje and looking at these Black women and looking at these warriors and watching them protect this young Black man. I thought about my hometown of Baltimore, and I thought about Black women in the street with baseball bats protecting their youth. And they are not looked on lovingly. They are not looked on as warriors at all. And what is the difference between those Black women in Baltimore in the streets trying to protect their young Black men from police and the Dora Milaje protecting T'Challa? And it takes me to your point about America and where we are, and where are our warriors and how do we fight, and do we identify black women as warriors. And how do we move forward with that? How do we move forward with giving black women who are in the streets fighting the same respect that we give the Dora Milaje, who are a real tribe of black women, but are not tangible for us?
It's kind of like, who is sanctioned, right? Who is sanctioned by the government? The Dora Milaje. Oh, sorry. I feel like it's like, who's sanctioned and who has been given value by the greater government. Like with the Dora Milaje, they are the royal guards to the king, so they have the power of the throne behind them, right? And for black Americans, specifically black women, the only validity that they have is from the greater black community, right? It's like the rest of America, or our version of the throne, you know, government, the presidency, what have you, has deemed that not only should these people, this group of people, black women specifically, not have power, but they are also a threat. So where the Dora Milaje, in a sense, are black women warriors, they are sanctioned and given power and given freedom. They're given financing, they're given training, they're given education, whereas black women that are seen as a threat, they are constantly, I mean, the pay gap, things like public education being basically stripped as it is, things that would give black women power are being taken from them. It's because they're not sanctioned.
Part of what we can do in our own discussions as well as in the world is to amplify the people who actually are doing what we're asking people to do. Because there are movements. Black Lives Matter matters because it is not just the struggle that began in a particular place around a particular issue, but because it's tying itself in different places, under different circumstances with different people as an amplification. So for my granddaughters, the warriors who are black women with baseball bats in Baltimore, they do exist as a reality that they affirm. So when we say people don't affirm, I want to add the corrective, but many of us do affirm that. Many of us do support that. And it's important not to forget that, lest our understanding of what we are becomes only the understanding that is amplified by the folks who don't value what we are. Again, I'm going back to Sincere. The conversation he wanted us to continually renew was a conversation that recognized, but if you are only thinking about those things there that are horrible, you cannot see yourself in struggle, and you can't see what's being built in that struggle. So there's some part of the conversations that I see, mainly because I keep going to the movie and eavesdropping on other people's conversations, but also because I'm all over social media looking at how people talk about that, is watching people, especially young people, say, but this is what we're doing, right? It's not the utopia of when we all become warriors in a way that the media gives it back to us, but it's, can I see myself as a warrior? Can I see the warriors around me? Can I recognize what we're doing? And Sincere's insistence was to say that popular culture not only provides the ground for the conversation about the thing that we're talking about, it provides the ground for a conversation about what we ourselves are and what we're doing. And I don't want us to lose that. At the same time, one of my paragraphs begins with, in the beginning there was colonialism, genocide, theft, and mass incarceration, right? So what is that recitation but my articulating the world that has made this moment, right? But if I only did that, then I would be caught up in imagining the world only as it exists as a result of the horrors, as opposed to anything else that could be going on.